The psalmist writes, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall lack nothing." Well, it's our desire at Hope today that you would know Jesus Christ as your shepherd. And that's how he identifies himself in our text today in John chapter 10, verses 1 through 22. In this text, we come across another of the I am statements that Jesus makes. It's one of my favorites. Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." Now, just before we read our text today, let me give you a little background to understand the context of what Jesus is saying. It's important. There are two contexts for us to understand in John chapter 10. First, we need to remember that John chapter 10 follows John chapter 9. Brilliant, I know, but it's true. John chapter 10 follows John chapter 9. And there we read of an event we studied last week, Jesus healing a blind man. And the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees, give the healed blind man a terrible time. They interrogate him in verses 15, 17, and 24. They doubt his story in verse 18. They hurl insults at him in verse 28. And eventually they throw him out of their presence. All of that in chapter 9 is part of the context of what Jesus is saying when he talks about false shepherds and their lack of care for the sheep. When you hear Jesus speak of false shepherds in John chapter 10, you are meant to say, "Oh, yes, we saw an example of that with the Pharisees just in the last chapter." But there is a second context that we need to know, and it is that at this time, when Jesus speaks these words, it is just before the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem. That's what we read in verse 22. The Feast of Dedication. We know this feast today to be called Hanukkah. You know Hanukkah, it happens every December during our Christmas celebration. And Hanukkah was celebrated in Jesus' day, but it's called the Feast of Dedication. In fact, in Hebrew, the word Hanukkah means dedication. Let me tell you about this feast. The feast found its roots in events that happened around 167 years before Jesus was born. So it isn't described in any Old Testament text. At that time, Greece was a major force in the Middle East. They were rich, they were powerful, and they were influencing everything with their culture. Kind of like the U.S. today influences much of the world with its culture. If the American army goes into a nation, often that nation will become Americanized. That's what we say. That the people adopt American style and attitudes and ideas of the U.S. Well, so at this time, nations were being Hellenized. Hellenism is the name that is given to the Greek culture. Everything at this time becomes Greek. The language, the thinking, the architecture, the customs of the day are Greek. They become popular. The customs of the Greeks become popular of the day. Even salads of the day become Greek. Everyone's eating Greek salad. And the phrase, "it's Greek to me," becomes popular. Well, in 167, a Greek ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes marches into Jerusalem, tears down its houses and walls, and burns the city. Jewish men are killed, women and children are enslaved. It becomes a capital offense to practice circumcision, observe the Sabbath, celebrate Jewish festivals, or possess scrolls of the Old Testament books. Pagan sacrifices become compulsory. This king even orders a large statue of Zeus to be put in the temple, and a number of days later orders that a pig be sacrificed in its honor. So a total desecration of the Jewish faith. And what's worse is that some of the Jewish religious leaders of the day participate in this. They don't look after the people, but they look after their own safety and their own security. Well, you can imagine the outrage of the Jewish people at this point. The Jewish people revolt. They've had it up to here with the Greeks. And through a kind of guerrilla warfare, they're able in December 167 to overthrow, 167 BC, to overthrow the army, recapture the temple, and rededicate it to God. And the story goes that when they went to rededicate the temple, they only found a small amount of oil in the temple that had not been defiled by the Greek heathens. But this small amount, which should have only lasted for 1 day, ended up lasting 8 days until new consecrated oil could be found. So, during Jesus' day, the people celebrated the rededication of the temple for 8 days, and it was decreed that a similar 8-day feast would be held every year. And so it continues to this day, and it's called Hanukkah. Now, here's the important part. There were and are many traditions that happen during this 8-day feast. The lighting of candles is popular to this day. But one important thing that happens that you may not know is that Ezekiel Chapter 34 is read during this feast. If you just turn to that in your Bibles, Ezekiel 34, and let me read the first 12 verses. Now understand that Ezekiel 34 was years and years and years before all that I just described to you. They were written much earlier and they describe another age. But the people of God said, boy, these words are similar to what happened to us in 167 BC. And so they are read every year at the Feast of Dedication. Ezekiel 34, verses 1 through 12. Let me read God's word for you at this time. At verse 1, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Now listen to the judgment and to the promise. God says here at verse 7, Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd, and so has been plundered, and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for my flock. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. And then verse 11, For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so will I look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. Why am I reading all this for you? Because it gives you a context. This text and these events are in the people's minds as Jesus speaks the words of John chapter 10. And this helps you understand why Jesus is saying what he says in John chapter 10, leading up to the Feast of Dedication. It's like Jesus is saying, you're thinking of leaders. You're meditating on spiritual shepherds. You are reading the promise of God and how he will shepherd his people and look after the scattered flock and rescue them. That's good. Let me tell you the truth, Jesus says. Let me tell you the truth about what you're reading. And so we come to John chapter 10, verses 1 through 22. Open your Bible and read along with me. I'll be reading from the New International Version. We hear God's word, John chapter 10. Very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought them out When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore Jesus said again, "Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and will go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not know the sheep, does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father." The Jews who heard these words were again divided. Many of them said, "He is demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him?" But others said, "These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind?" Then came the festival of dedication at Jerusalem. This is God's word to us today, and we give thanks to him for it. Let's pray together. Savior, like a shepherd lead us. Much we need your tender care. In your pleasant pastures feed us. With your word and the fullness of your Spirit, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I want to get to verse 11 where Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." So let me just bring you up to that point. Leading up to the Feast of Dedication, Jesus speaks, and he says at verse 1 that there are some shepherds who have not entered the sheep pen by the gate, but climb in by some other way. He's speaking about those who have responsibility over the people of God. Given the context, this is what he's talking about. There are people who have leadership over the people of God, but do not have the authority of God in their lives. He's speaking about false shepherds, false leaders over the people of God. And you say, how can someone take leadership over the people of God without God's blessing? And it doesn't take much to imagine. To think of ways to falsely enter into responsibility over the people of God. There are those who are given authority over the people of God by virtue of their school degrees. You have a Master's of Divinity degree? Great, you lead us. But while learning is good, diplomas don't guarantee that a person should lead the people of God. Some have authority over the people of God because of their dynamic personalities. You've got charisma? Great, lead us. But a dynamic personality is a poor substitute for the authority of God. There are many people who have leadership in the church, but really they shouldn't. This is what Jesus says. There are some people who have entered the sheep pen into authority over the people of God without the blessing of God on them. They've not entered through the gate. And we know it to be true. Only those who have entered through the gate, that is, who have the authority of God, should lead God's people. It's only a person who knows the horror of their own sin and the grace of God in Christ who can lead others into the same experience. It's only a person who has experienced God's ability to make a person new that is able to point people to the newness that is in Christ. It is only a person who is full of the Holy Spirit who can lead others to streams of living water that God will fill us with in His power and strength. It's only a pastor or a shepherd who walks daily under the leadership of Him who is the good shepherd who can genuinely lead the people of God. Well, Jesus continues and says, there is a shepherd in verses 3 to 5 that does have the authority of God, the watchman. God has opened the gate for him, and the sheep listen to him, and he calls to them, and he leads them. At verse 6, we read that the people don't understand what he's telling them. They fail to make the connection to all that I have just told you about the Pharisees mistreating and the healed blind man. They fail to see the connection to what he's saying to the promise of God in Ezekiel 34 to send a true shepherd who would truly care for the sheep. So, in his grace, he goes on to explain to them what he has said, and he adds details to the picture to help us understand. And this time, he gives us two I am statements. He says first at verse 7 that he is the gate. That changes the picture up a bit, doesn't it? At verses 1 through 6, he is the one who entered through the gate. Now he says at verse 7 that he is the gate. Now don't let that confuse you. We know that he and the Father are one. So he can say that he enters through the gate, who is given authority, and he is the gate at the same time. At verse 11, he gives us the second I am statement, and he says, I am the good shepherd. Now, it's on this statement that we'll focus our time and our attention on verse 11. Here, Jesus makes 3 points. First, he says that he is the good shepherd. Second, he is the good shepherd who lays down his life for us. And third, he is the good shepherd who knows his sheep. So I've given you a lot of background, a lot of information up to this point. We have to ask, what difference does it all make? What difference does it make to you and to me that Jesus is the good shepherd who laid down his life and knows his sheep? What difference does it all make? And I want us to think of 3 differences that all this makes. It makes a difference in our dependence, it makes a difference in our obedience, and it makes a difference in our assurance. So first, Jesus is the good shepherd. That's the first point. And this makes a difference in your dependence upon him. Who do you depend on? Jesus says that he is the good shepherd. And as soon as he says that, you have to realize that you are a sheep. And that means that you're depending on someone or something in your life. And you have to ask, who or what is it? Who do you depend on? Are you depending on a false shepherd? Or are you depending on the good shepherd? If you're a sheep, and you are, then you must be depending on something or someone. It's the nature of sheep. They must depend on someone. When we lived out in the country, we had all sorts of domestic animals straying through our forest. People from the city would drive up to the country and drop them off. Cats, we would see stray cats, and they were quite capable, for the most part. They were quite capable to survive in the wild on their own. Now, don't use this as a justification to drop off your cat that you don't want up in the country. Don't do that. It's cruel, and you shouldn't do it. But they were able to survive, for the most part, on their own. Dogs managed just fine. And then we would get those animals that would break out of their pens from nearby farms, cows and horses. They would get out of their pen. They can manage. All those animals seem to have intelligence to survive on their own, but not sheep. It's a helpless animal on its own. It needs a shepherd. Do you know that if a sheep is turned over on its back, it cannot get up again by itself? It's called a cast sheep or a cast down sheep. It will just lie there on its back, its feet in the air, simply kicking the air with its feet. It may bleat for help, but basically it just lies there lashing about in frightened frustration. Sheep need a shepherd. They need a farmer to care for them. They ever seen a stray sheep? Janet and I will never forget. About the third year we owned our country property, we looked out our dining room window and there was a stray sheep just standing there, just looking around, lost. Now, it didn't know what to do with its freedom. It had no direction. It had no discernment. It ate everything and anything in my garden. It could have been poison for all it knew. It didn't care. It just ate everything. Without a farmer or a shepherd to care for this sheep, to lead it to green pastures, it would eat and drink anything. Without a shepherd, a sheep dies. Do you understand that? Do you get it? We love the image of the Lord being our shepherd, and we have this warm and cuddly, mushy picture of Jesus being our good shepherd. And we have these ideal pictures of the shepherd tenderly taking the lamb in his arms and cradling it. And all of that is true. There is care, there is compassion and intimacy. But my friends, this picture of Jesus as our good shepherd and we as his sheep calls for utter and complete dependence upon him. So understand, to say that Jesus is your good shepherd is to say that he means everything to you. He is the center of your life, the core of your being, the sustainer of your life, the goal of your life, the lover of your soul, the focus of your attention, the anchor, the root, the sunshine, the planet around which you rotate, the authority over your life, the sovereign, the ruler, the manager, the boss, your bridegroom, the bread, the light, the water of life. If Jesus were to stop breathing, you would cease to exist. That's what it means to call Jesus your shepherd. It speaks of utter and complete dependence. Who is it that you are depending on now for life? You may say, as many men do, well, I don't depend on anyone. I make my own way through this life. I am a self-made man. But don't you see, if you say that, you are depending on someone to be your shepherd. You're depending on yourself. And can I say to you, you make a very poor shepherd. To lead you through this life, you know nothing of the future. You know nothing of life eternal. There is only one shepherd you can depend on, and that is Jesus Christ, who is the good shepherd. You see, knowing that Jesus is your shepherd makes a difference on what you depend on. Dependence. But also verse 11 says, Jesus is the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. So what? Well, this affects your obedience to him. Listen, Jesus is the one who laid down his life for you and for me. That's what the text says. He lays down his life for the sheep. That means instead of. The truth that we learn in Isaiah 53 verse 6 is that we all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. We've rejected God, we've turned our back on God and said no to his rule in our lives. We've sought to depend on others. We owe God our lives for our rebellion. But the Lord, Isaiah continues, has laid the price of our sin, our rebellion, on Jesus. Jesus Christ has paid the price for us with his own life. He's laid down his life for us. And I pray that if you don't know that to be true in your life, that your eyes would be open to the fact that you are a great sinner and have a great Savior. And when we do realize this, that affects our obedience to him, doesn't it? Ask yourself, what are you obeying in this world? What attitudes are you allowing to rule you? What priorities are you allowing to dictate your life? Who are you obeying? And then question, have they given their life for you? Have they died for you? Have the priorities and things that you give obedience to died for you? Have they taken on your sin and your darkness and hatred and bitterness and jealousy and greed and prejudice and all that is ungodly about you and said, I will die for that? No. No, not the NBA, not the NFL or CFL or NHL or MLB. No, your work, no, it has it. Netflix, YouTube, Disney, Prime, social media, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter. No. Jesus Christ has died for you. He deserves your obedience because he's given his life for you. And Jesus goes on at verse 12 and says that there are two kinds of shepherds in this world. There are trustworthy shepherds and there are false shepherds. The false shepherd is the one who tries to shepherd the flock but doesn't have the approval of God. The false shepherd sees the wolf coming and they run, they abandon the sheep. The false shepherd cares nothing for the sheep. Philip Keller, in his classic book entitled A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23, tells of how on the ranch next to his, there was a tenant sheepman who was the most indifferent manager he had ever met. He ought never to have been allowed to keep sheep, said Keller. His flock was always thin, weak, and riddled with disease or parasites. Again and again, they would come and stand at the fence, staring blankly through the woven wire at the green, lush pastures which my flock enjoyed. Had they been able to speak, says Keller, I am sure they would have said, oh, to be set free from this awful owner. But thanks be to God, this is not the kind of shepherd that you and I have now. We used to be owned by that kind of shepherd, but not any longer. Now we have a trustworthy shepherd who is the one who even acts like a gate and steadfastly watches over his sheep with care and compassion and concern. Jesus is the trustworthy shepherd. As F.B. Meyer points out, he has the shepherd's heart beating with pure and generous love for you and me. He has the shepherd's eye that takes on the whole flock so that not one of his lambs is overlooked. He has the shepherd's faithfulness, which will never fail or forsake. He has the shepherd's strength so that he is able to deliver us from the jaw of the lion and the paw of the bear. He has the shepherd's tenderness so that even the tiniest lamb can know his care and the weakest saint will be gently led and given strength. Surely he is a shepherd worthy of your obedience and mine. And do you see that with this truth about Jesus being our good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep, there's a whole shift in our motivation for obedience here. I mean, if you think, we very often obey authority figures like our parents for one of three reasons. First, we may obey them because we're afraid to face their wrath. We don't want to get grounded or whatever the punishment is. Second, we may obey our parents because we want something from them. You know, if we do what they say, then they'll give us this good thing. Third, we may obey our parents because we feel obligated. After all, they work hard to put food on the table and a roof over our heads. Three reasons for obedience. And I don't need to tell you that it's the same in our relationship with God. How many people obey God because they don't want to be struck by lightning or be sent to hell? And how many others obey God because they want something from him? And others obey him because they feel obligated. After all, he did die for me. But here, listen, here's the question you have to answer. Are you obeying Jesus Christ simply because you've experienced his love and his sacrifice and you love him in return? Do you obey him because you're the apple of his eye, his beloved, his bride, his joy, and he wants the best for you? Do you obey him because in turn you are enraptured with him and want to bring him joy just as he brings you joy? That's a whole different level of obedience. It has nothing to do with fear or wanting to get something or obligation, but flows from a heart that is touched by the death of Jesus Christ, the unending love of God, and knowing that he is your shepherd, and he will never leave you, never forsake you, and you love him in return. Do you find obedience to God to be drudgery and dull and boring thing that you have to do? Can I suggest this could be a sign to you? You're obeying out of fear, or out of a desire for selfish gain, or out of obligation. But if you have fallen deeply in love with him because of who he is and what he has done on the cross, then service and obedience to him become a joy. And it's that kind of obedience that lasts too, isn't it? I mean, if you obey God out of fear or wanting to get something out of him, it won't last. Your faith is temporary. But if you have it deep in your mind and in your heart that Jesus Christ is your shepherd who gave his life for you, well, that kind of obedience goes the distance. So you see, knowing that Jesus is your shepherd affects your dependence, it affects your obedience, and then this, it affects your assurance of his love. Verse 14 says, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Look at that. How does the Father know the Son, and how does the Son know the Father? How would you describe that relationship? Just skim down to verse 30 of chapter 10. Jesus says, I and the Father are one. The relationship is that close. It is. The Father knows the Son, and the Son knows the Father intimately. This is important because this is how Jesus describes his relationship with you. He knows you just as the Father knows him, and he knows the Father. That means he knows you to the core. He knows your passions and desires. He knows your weaknesses and strengths. He knows your secrets and the things you don't dare say. He knows you intimately. He says in verse 3 of our text that the good shepherd knows his sheep by name. He knows you intimately. And yet he says, I laid down my life for the sheep. Do you see the assurance of that? He knows you. He knows you intimately, and still he laid down his life for you. Do you see the assurance of that? If knowing you, he still gave himself for you, and instead of you, what makes you think that there's something that can make him turn away from you now? What makes you think that there's something that will make him forsake you? What makes you think that he will abandon you? He knew your rottenness of your soul before he died for you. Do you think that you could do something now that will make him change his mind about you? Do you think that he could possibly know something new about you that could make him change his mind about you and cause him to walk away from you? No. You weren't that great before, and he still laid down his life for you. Do you see the assurance of that? Do you see how you are held by him? Do you see how you're secure in his hand? Do you see the truth of Romans 8 illustrated here? If God is for us, who can be against you? Who will bring any charge against you? Who will separate you from the love of Christ? Shall the troubles of this world, like trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword, separate you from Christ? No. You have a good shepherd who knows you intimately and will never, ever forsake you. Or troubles that attack your spirit, like death and life, or angels or demons, or the present or the future, or powers or height or depth, or anything else in all creation be able to snatch you away from the love of Christ? No! You have the full assurance because he is your shepherd who knows you and gave his life for you. My friends, there are some of you who suffer under the mistaken idea that someone can snatch you out of God's hand. But listen, that is false thinking. And I pray that you would know the peace that comes from the assurance that you belong to God because the Good Shepherd has laid down his life for you. And the price for your sin has been paid for, and nothing more is demanded from you, and nothing can separate you from him. So, go and joyfully obey him. Go and joyfully live in dependence upon him. Go and praise his name and live for him. Let us pray. Lord Jesus, thank you that you are the good shepherd who has laid down his life for us. Thank you for your grace toward us. May we taste the truth of today's word and fall ever more deeply in love with Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.